afternoon, and thank you for joining the Dove Recovery House for Women podcast. I'm Wendy Noe, the Executive Director of Dove Recovery House for Women, and I am your host of this podcast. Please tell your friends, your family, your colleagues about this podcast. Make sure you subscribe and follow, and again, share with your friends. I'm really excited today because I have one of my favorite doves here, Jillian. Jillian was a client at Dove House a couple of years ago. She went through our program and has just blossomed into an incredible woman. And so it makes my heart really happy to see this beautiful young woman sitting across from me. So today we're going to just talk about your journey and what got you here and history. In a few weeks, we're going to talk to your mom and get a different perspective, which should be fun. So Jillian, why don't you tell our listeners about yourself?
Okay, well, I am Jillian. I have been sober since March 27th of 2018. However, that is not when I started my journey at Dove House. I got to Dove Recovery House in May of 2017, but I bumped my head a few more times before I was actually ready to surrender and live a different way.
What do you mean when you bumped your head a few times?
Had a couple of relapses. They weren't the worst in terms of, the outside circumstances, in terms of living situations or the things that I've done for drugs and alcohol, but that inside brokenness and complete defeatedness was beyond anything that I've ever experienced before. And so I think it just brought me to a level of, if this is living, I don't want it. And since I'm still alive, I better start listening and be quiet and take all the suggestions thrown my way to actually recover and not just put on this facade that that's what's happening.
Yeah. So to kind of go into a little bit more in depth, Jillian came into the program pretty hard-headed, but presented very well. So she would appear that she had it all figured out and she was doing everything right. And the next thing we'd know, surprisingly, Jillian would relapse. And so it really took some tough love and some hard conversations to get her ready for this path. I know that for a few times, I really thought we were going to lose you. I thought we would be burying you. And so that's why I'm really excited that you're here today, because you're here and you have a journey and a story to share. So let's back up a little bit. When did you start using drugs and alcohol?
So I started drinking in high school. It was very recreational, very quote unquote normal in comparison to what everyone else that, was in my grade or my age was doing. I didn't have any negative consequences for socially drinking at a party or at a graduation party or with friends or anything like that. And I didn't know this back then, but I think when sort of the addict behavior started was when I started smoking marijuana. And that wasn't until my senior year of high school when it started happening every day. I was involved in volleyball and other recreational activities, and all of that changed by the second semester of my senior year, and smoking weed and a guy was more important to me than anything. So that's kind of where it all started. Dating that guy, I was introduced to pain pills and other various pills. I would try different pills, and the craziest part to me about all of this is that I didn't even like it. I didn't like the way that they made me feel, but I continued to do them every once in a while until I did get an effect that I did like. So after that, I just was kind of recreationally using these pills and still smoking marijuana every day. I still wasn't really having any negative consequences, though, for my behavior. I was pretty good at managing what I was doing and pretty much keeping it a secret. I mean, I knew that my parents knew that I partied recreationally, but it wasn't anything that ever got out of hand. I, wasn't getting in trouble with the law. I was paying my bills, so I don't think that they thought that it was anything outside of what kids in college do. So I did go to college for a year, and that kind of behavior just sort of continued, and that relationship that I was in with that guy got violent out of nowhere. And I endured that for 2 more years before I decided I can't do this anymore. And when we broke up, I still wanted to eat pills because that had been the norm for the last couple of years. And so I continued to do that and got into another relationship where basically the same behaviors were being displayed. It just slowly but surely progressively turned into 1 pill a day to 5 pills a day and then 10 pills a day. And eventually it got up to 20 to 25 pills a day. I'm probably 20 or 21 at this point, maybe 22, and I'm eating pills every single day and don't think that there's anything wrong with that. So I'll never forget the first time I went on vacation with a couple of girlfriends and I only brought a certain amount of pills with me. I ran out like the first day there and I started experiencing withdrawal symptoms and I had no idea that that's what was going on. I didn't know that my body was physically dependent on these drugs. And so when I finally found that out, because it was explained to me what was going on with my body, there was like a mental switch in my brain that it wasn't about wanting them, it was about needing them. So the hunt was on for more and more and more, and it just was never enough. Like most people's stories, the pills weren't working anymore, and I was eating so many of them and began snorting them, and nothing was really creating the high that I once was achieving. I knew somebody that had heroin, and I had heard that it was stronger, cheaper, easier to find, and it really was just that simple. After I tried heroin for the first time, I was like, well, I'm done with the pills. I made all those excuses that I think everybody does. I was disgusted with needle use, and I was like, I would never do that, and that won't be my story. And not even 2 months later, I began injecting heroin, and I never looked back. And so that was just kind of like the beginning of what was really awful to come. I'm still kind of managing, but my money's getting tighter and tighter. And then I'm starting to not show up for work if I don't feel good because I couldn't get heroin. And those behaviors started to come into play. And then my parents found out that I was using heroin. And so they naturally were very concerned and did an intervention. And I went to outpatient treatment that I completely manipulated the entire time I was there. In fact, I don't even think I stopped using while I was there. I think that I just manipulated not taking a drug screen. So that kind of stuff happened for probably another 2 to 3 years. The consequences did start to get worse. My parents stopped giving me money and I started like crashing vehicles and couldn't hold a job, definitely wasn't in school anymore. The relationships with the people around me in terms of friends, family, employers, everything was starting to tarnish and not be okay anymore. And then I started dating this guy who introduced me to methamphetamines. And not to say that my life wasn't very quickly going downhill as it was just doing heroin, but meth totally just sped up that process. And so now I'm not just addicted to one awful substance, I'm addicted to 2 and I need both of them. The change in me that happened when I would use meth was just unbelievable. It was crazy and I was just not myself at all. And I was like a psychopath and it was just really bad. And I would pick apart my face and my body and I literally looked like a walking zombie and I was okay with that, you know. By this time, I'm definitely not allowed at my parents' house anymore. They've changed the locks. I end up getting arrested. And then as soon as I was released, I got arrested 4 months later. I did get the option to go into Marion County's drug diversion program. I was not very successful with that in the beginning. I was still trying to figure out a way to successfully use these substances and live life and be happy. And that's just not possible. So that kind of went on for another year. And, you know, at this time too, I'm like in and out of different treatment facilities. I think I've been to Harbor Lights like 7 different times. And I was there one time, court ordered through drug treatment court, and I met a guy and we started hanging out. And a couple of months later, we started using together. And then I got arrested again and I went back to jail and I found out I was pregnant.
So you found out in jail that you were pregnant.
Correct. And obviously I wasn't sober. So Not being sober, finding out that I'm pregnant, sitting in Marion County jail was just like the black cloud was just completely over my head. And so I decided that I was going to keep this baby, and I was in jail for, I want to say, close to 60 days. So by the time Marion County Jail put me on methadone, because I had opiates in my system when I came in there and I was pregnant. So by the time I was released, there was no getting off of methadone. I was released to my parents' house on house arrest, and I didn't get my house arrest bracelet off until I think 3 months before I had my son. And I did okay on medicated assisted treatment, but I still wasn't dealing with the stuff that I had completely shoved down 20 some odd years. Even though the methadone seemed to be working, it just wasn't really solving the inside issues that I was dealing with. So I delivered a healthy baby boy on February 24th of 2015, and I jumped right into mom mode. His father was in prison when I delivered him, so it was just me and him the first 8 months of his little life. Then he was released. We didn't really have anything left other than this child, so we kind of went our separate ways. I was working and I was going to meetings, and I was attempting to do as much as I could with steps and a 12-step program, but again, it just was all like very surface stuff, and I really didn't know what I was doing because I was more focused on being a mother. So I eventually got sick and tired of that, of doing all of this by myself and not having any help and not ever getting any real treatment under my belt. And I ended up using again. I took my kid places that I should have never taken him. And I thank God today that he was a baby and probably will never remember that, but I'll remember that. And so I eventually left because I didn't want to do that anymore. And I was gone for 7 months. I saw my son once in 7 months before my mom reached out one last time to see if I was ready to go to treatment. And I basically told her to move on without me, that I didn't want to get better and that I was okay doing this until I was dead. So that kind of freaked her out. And my living conditions at the time were living in an abandoned house with no running water, with a couple of other addicts that were doing the same things that I were. There was rats and cockroaches and just bottom of the barrel living. And I was okay with that. That's how messed up on the inside I was and messed up my brain was. And so for whatever reason, my mom reached out one last time and offered treatment, and I said yes. And I actually let her pick me up. That's when I went and detoxed, and then I came to Dove Recovery House 2 weeks later in May of 2017 and started my journey here.
Do you remember the look on your mom's face when she saw you for the first time in 7 months after picking you up from that abandoned house? What was that like?
It was terrible. I mean, I don't even think that she was prepared for what she saw that day. I'm a mother, and I can't even imagine what that felt like. Seeing your only daughter walk up and you haven't seen her in 7 months and looking the way that I did. I hadn't bathed in probably a month. My hair was matted together. I had open sores all over my face, all over my body. My clothes were dirty. I smelled. It was terrible. It was absolutely terrible. And Lord only knows, I probably was living in a house that had bed bugs and all kinds of other stuff going on that I just was completely oblivious to, because none of that mattered. All that mattered to me was getting one more to get to this level of oblivion that I couldn't ever seem to achieve again. So when I got to Dove House, I was really in a weird space in my head. You know, a part of me really wanted to do this, and a part of me was like, I've tried this before and it's never worked, and I just don't know what's going to be different now. There was definitely something different about Dove House, though, than any other treatment facility I'd been to. The second that I walked in, it was an immediate love. There's just something in the walls in this place that makes you feel at home and makes you feel like you're a part of, and makes you feel like they truly care about your well-being and want you to get better. And not to say that the other places that I went to didn't do that, but if they did, I wasn't open to recognizing it. I did try to do the best that I could, and I was trying to do the right things by getting a sponsor, working the steps, and I did do those things to a certain extent, but there were certain behaviors that I was still holding on to. And I think the biggest one was relationships and being around men and not being around women and not taking every suggestion that was thrown my way. I was still trying to lie and manipulate and break rules and just do all these things that don't seem like a big deal, but in the grand scheme of things, like, that's where it all starts. If I can't even follow these simple rules, how am I ever going to take care of my child or have a life outside of these walls one day? And all of that was just so not apparent to me at the time. So I did okay for like 5 months. One of the best things that happened to me at Dove House was trauma therapy. I went through some sexual trauma as a child at a young age, and that was something that I never dealt with. And so Mary tried to get me to talk about that, and I told her that I was fine and that it was so long ago that it didn't matter anymore, and she saw right through that. It took me almost a year later to actually like open up and deal with that, even after being at the Dove House. And so we dealt with other things first, and I'm doing quote unquote everything that I'm supposed to be doing on the outside, but on the inside I still have a bunch of garbage that I haven't dealt with. So I ended up relapsing about 5 months in, and I came back and I was put on restriction. And then I think not even a month later, I had another relapse. And then I think about a month later after that is when it was the last time I used, and I almost didn't make it. I overdosed and I had to be rushed to the hospital and hit with Narcan. And when I woke up, I just remembered feeling so hopeless and so defeated and so tired of doing this. Using had lost its fun a long time ago, and I wasn't even really getting high anymore. And it was just like, why do I keep doing something that literally makes my misery more miserable? So came back to Dove House, and I was faced with an ultimatum, like, we basically don't know what to do with you. We give you freedom, and you relapse, we put you on restriction, and you relapse, and you're really going to have to do the work this time if we let you stay. I think that was, without knowing it, my first level of surrender, because I remembered thinking in that moment, like, Dove House says jump, and I say how high. That was kind of just the beginning of a very hard road to breaking all of these habits that I had carried around with me for 20 plus some odd years. The biggest one being that I was never told no. I was always told yes and more and yes and more. So I got told no a lot. And it really crushed this 28-year-old brat that was walking around. I finally came to the conclusion through Dove House's help that I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how to stay sober, and I was going to die if I did not accept the help that was being given to me. And so it made it a little bit easier to deal with those things. And I wouldn't show anybody that I was kicking and screaming about all these no's, but I definitely would go upstairs to my room and like have a whole temper tantrum by myself.
I know that does not surprise me.
I know.
And so today here you are.
Yes.
Doing great, sober. So what's life look like today?
Oh, life is pretty amazing today. I have an amazing job. While I was at Dove House, I got a volunteer opportunity at the job that I still have today. So it started as a volunteer, moved into a part-time position, moved into a full-time position, moved into a salaried paid position. I can't even believe it. I can't remember the last time that I held a job for 2 years. I don't even know if I ever have. So when I came to Dove House, my parents had guardianship of my son. We dissolved that guardianship last summer, and he just started living with me full time again right around my 2-year mark, which was in March of 2020. And it's been a pretty good transition. He's definitely struggled a little bit because he's older now, and Grammy gave him whatever he wanted and mommy doesn't, and there's rules and different kinds of structure, but I think he's transitioning really well. I have an amazing partner that I get to do life with who is also an addict, a recovering addict. we have a really nice little life together, and I'm hopeful that one day he'll be my husband.
Is that a hint?
Yes, totally. Maybe we should let him hear this. I think the best part about everything is that I've been sober. I've stayed sober through some really hard times. And, I've got to experience a lot of things that I wouldn't have gotten to experience if I hadn't gotten sober and stayed sober. And I get to help other women, not just at the Dove House, but in the fellowship that I work, and to see them have that light bulb or aha moment is just the greatest gift. And somebody did that for me. And the fact that I get to do that for somebody else and walk these women through the steps and have them have these awakenings that we have is just, it's priceless. I've never experienced anything that's more pure and happy than that. And that's kind of what fuels my fire and keeps me going, because in turn, these women help me too. And so it's just one big circle. But I think overall, more than anything, is that I have been happy for 2.5 years straight. It's not to say that I haven't experienced some hard times, but I no longer dread life. I no longer want to run from it. I no longer want to numb it. That in and of itself is a complete miracle,
I think one of the interesting things is, one of the things that we see with individuals with substance use disorder is, and you've referenced it, is that you want to numb out. You want to numb the pain. You don't want to experience life because it's too hard. And we see when bad things happen, addicts tend to go back to what numbs them out. And for me, the indication that you are doing incredible is the fact that we just had a major loss in our lives. And it was your best friend, someone that you loved, someone that I loved, a fellow Dove, who died from an overdose. And you pulled it together and you kept it together. And through heartbreak, we don't compound and we don't stack and we don't put other things on it, because the sadness and the pain doesn't go away. Right. Even if you numb it out for a little while. And so you've kept it together, and you helped plan a funeral and a service, and we got to memorialize an incredible woman who unfortunately died from this disease. And the fact that you get to sit here today and you get to share and carry her memory and yet pass this love on to other women is, I think, what makes it so special. And it's what you talk about, the love being in the walls of Dove House, and it's not from the staff. I mean, it's part of it, but it's the women that come through these doors with so much love to give and so much love to be received. And these relationships and this sisterhood is what makes Dove House stand out. It's what makes us unique. It's the fact that we know you deserve to be loved, and we know that you have so much love to give back, and we become a family and we show up for one another, and you pay it forward with the women that walk through these doors. I think, to be a part of your journey and to see this young, broken woman who you were when you walked through, and these hiccups that happened, and yet you became vulnerable. And only when we become vulnerable can we really make those changes. Can we acknowledge and accept? I mean, we all have to be vulnerable to say, here's where I'm broken, and this is what I need to do to fix myself. And this is how I become the best version of myself. And you trusted us enough to do that. You relinquished your power and control, and we didn't take your power and take your control in a way to hurt you, but let's just take a moment and breathe and let us think for you, so that when your brain is clear enough, you'll be ready to think for yourself.
Exactly. The reality is that I had not made a solid, positive decision in about 10 years when I came in through Dove House's doors, and I needed help. I think that that's probably one of the hardest things in recovery, is that we have to admit that we're powerless and that we do need help, right? And it's so much deeper than that. We can all probably admit that we have a problem, but to have somebody else come in and give us suggestions and tell us, hey, I don't know if that's a good idea right now, or maybe you should try this. It's we don't want to hear that. I think that I can speak for pretty much anybody that I know. Every single addict has trust issues, and that usually comes from trauma. And unless we get to the focus point of where all of this behavior started, it's been my experience that there's just not a whole lot of room for change and growth. And if that doesn't take place, then we're probably not going to stay sober very long. I used to have these conditions on my sobriety, like if I lost a friend or if I lost a parent or if I lost my child, that there was no way I could stay sober through that. And I just buried one of the people that was closest to me, and I'm sitting here still sober. And in fact, I think the biggest miracle in that whole situation is that not once throughout this entire experience, my brain didn't even go there. I used to be somebody that couldn't go 5 minutes without thinking about when I was going to get another one or how I was going to get high again. It was just this obsession that I could not get out of my head. It wasn't even a thought. It wasn't even in the forefront of my brain. I'm truly grateful for that, because we don't need more tragedies than there already is. You know, we're burying her, and it was sad and hard enough for anybody that was involved. And we don't need to have more doves or more women or anybody that's suffering from the disease of addiction to be buried along because they can't cope. I think that having more resources to let people know that it doesn't have to be that way is so important, because I truly believe that the dove that we lost didn't think that there was a way out. And it's all those things that you were just talking about, getting vulnerable and believing that whoever it is in your life is there for you, has your best interest at heart, and that it doesn't mean that you're dumb. It doesn't mean that you're stupid or not intelligent or anything. It just means that you have a disease. I don't know anything about cancer, so I'm not going to tell a doctor how to diagnose me. And it's the same thing with addiction. You know, I would never do that in that kind of situation. But then when I come over here, I want to still try to run my life and think that I know what's best. And that's just not the case. And unfortunately, I have seen way too many people die from that kind of thinking. I believe that everything happens for a reason. And I think that I really got to see how much of a program I actually work when this happened, because like I said, I had those conditions on my sobriety and I didn't feel it necessary to pick up a drink or a drug because my friend died. And it doesn't mean that it's not painful. It doesn't mean that it's not sad. I've definitely been going through the 5 stages of grief, and it's not easy. And my brain wants to tell me, we don't want to feel that. That's not what we do. We don't want to feel these things. Like, we don't feel these things. But the reality is that if I want to continue to be a sister to my Dove House girls, and a sponsor and a person in recovery and an employee, a daughter, a mother, a girlfriend, all these things, I can't not continue to grow. And if I were to have picked up over this and not used my tools that I've gathered the last 2.5 years, I would have gone down backwards, and I don't want to do that anymore. I actually finally have a life that is better than anything I ever hoped it could be, and I believe that it can continue to just keep getting better. And I know that in order to keep that, I have to continue to do the work, and makes it a little bit easier to do the work. You know, my sponsor got in my butt last night. You know, I'm not immune from still making mistakes and not dealing with things correctly or having bad thinking. It just looks a little bit different today. The obsession of wanting to use drugs or alcohol has been removed from me by the grace of God. So now it's like I almost just maybe relapse on thinking or behaviors, and that's less damaging to my personal life and those around me than if I were to pick up heroin.
Well, we're all going to make mistakes, especially when we're grieving.
Yes.
It's what you do from those mistakes. How do you grow and learn? I'm proud of you.
Thank you.
It's an honor to know you and to be a part of your journey.
Thanks.
And thanks for doing this.
Yeah, no problem.
I hope that our listeners learn a little bit more about addiction and the face of the disease. And I encourage you to check out our website, doverecoveryhouse.org. If you know someone that's suffering from the disease of addiction, please refer them to us. Don't let them isolate and don't ignore them. Isolation is a reason that people stay sick. So make sure you refer them to us. Check out our social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn for more information about Dove Recovery House. And again, make sure to tell your friends and family to subscribe and follow us on this podcast. If you have questions, make sure you leave us a comment. We want to hear from you. What do you want to know? How can we best communicate this message to you? Thank you for your time and for listening. Stay safe and healthy. Take care.